Okay, so, when we think about the very beginnings of AI research, the story we usually hear focuses on like labs in the West, the US, the UK kind of leading the way.
Right, right.
But what if I told you that the Soviet Union, like right from the start, was putting a ton of resources, making these really serious early investments into AI?
Yeah.
Today, we're diving into this super interesting document from 1964, a U.S. intelligence report that gives us this like rare glimpse behind the Iron Curtain to see what exactly the Soviets were doing in this like brand new field.
Absolutely, yeah. This is like, for anyone who's fascinated by how these like complex areas of knowledge kind of emerge and how different, global contexts can shape their development.
Uh-huh.
This report, it's called Artificial Intelligence Research in the USSR, and it's a gold mine.
Yeah.
It's basically the U.S. trying to like figure out, how much progress the Soviets were making in AI.
Yeah.
And what's really striking is like how broad their investigation was.
Exactly. Yeah. It wasn't just about, the hardware, the nuts and bolts.
Yeah. The report makes it clear right away that AI research was seen as this fusion, the melting pot of all these different scientific disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
Biology, physiology, psychology, all kinds of engineering fields, and all of it grounded in mathematics.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Soviets, working within this framework of cybernetics, had this very practical definition of AI.
Okay.
They saw it as machines that could basically solve problems and make decisions.
Okay.
So our mission today is to really dig into what that actually meant in practice in the Soviet Union of the early 1960s.
Yeah.
Their priorities, the philosophical ideas behind it all, and maybe even some surprises for you about how ambitious they really were.
Yeah, that's a great plan. So, I think one of the things that jumps out right away from this report is the sheer level of official recognition and support that AI research was getting in the Soviet Union.
So, while they might have gotten started a little bit later than the U.S., by 1964, the report's suggesting that they were pretty much on par in terms of their progress.
Wow.
But the big difference, the report really emphasizes this, was the magnitude of official recognition and support that the Soviets were giving to AI research.
So they caught up in a way, even though they started later.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so why? Why this huge backing from the Soviet government and the Communist Party?
Well, the report points to this fundamental belief they had that these decision-making machines, that this was essential to the successful management of their, increasingly complex economic and social system. It wasn't just intellectual curiosity. They saw this as a crucial tool for running the entire state, basically.
So it wasn't some kind of abstract research project. This was very much tied to their national goals and ambitions.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, the report even talks about substantial support and party encouragement, painting this picture of a really, really deliberate, state-driven push for AI development.
Uh-huh. But do you think there were any potential downsides to this?
So the report identifies 4 key areas. Pattern recognition by machines, which is basically, teaching computers to see and identify things.
Uh-huh.
Machine learning, getting computers to learn and improve based on their experiences.
Okay.
Planning and induction in problem-solving machines, so figuring out how to get them to come up with solutions and make generalizations.
All right.
And finally, brain modeling, which was all about, trying to understand and replicate how the human brain works.
So these are foundational elements of AI research, even as we understand it today.
Absolutely, yeah.
The fact that the Soviets were already tackling these core areas, way back then, really shows their long-term thinking, right?
Totally. It speaks to how seriously they were taking this whole field.
Yeah, yeah. But the report also, dives into the philosophy behind it all.
Yes, it does.
This wasn't just about building clever machines, was it?
No, not at all. The report talks about this really intense re-examination of basic philosophical attitudes that was happening in the Soviet Union at the time, about the nature of the brain, of mind, and of man himself. And all of this was being seen through the lens of their dominant ideology, dialectical materialism.
Right.
So the development of AI was very much intertwined with these fundamental questions about consciousness, about what it means to be human, from this specifically Marxist perspective.
So it wasn't just a technical pursuit, it was also this like philosophical and ideological exploration.
Exactly. And it wasn't just, a few academics thinking about this in their ivory towers.
Yeah.
The report mentions this major conference that happened in Moscow in 1962, specifically on the philosophical problems of cybernetics.
Wow. Okay, so they had a whole conference on this.
Yeah, and it was a big deal. It was sponsored by like major scientific organizations and even the party committee.
Hmm.
So that really shows you how much importance they placed on these theoretical issues.
1,000 people. That's like a huge gathering, especially for that time.
It is, yeah. And the report points out that a lot of the presentations, like 6 out of 10, were specifically about artificial intelligence.
Wow.
So clearly AI was a major focus of this philosophical investigation.
Okay, so what was the big question? What were they really wrestling with at this conference?
Well, the central question that seemed to generate the most debate was this, like, seemingly simple one. Can a machine think?
Right, the classic question.
Yeah, but as the report kind of cleverly points out, this one question actually opened up this like whole can of worms, all these other related issues.
Like what else were they grappling with?
So they were debating whether it was even theoretically possible to like fully reproduce the complexity of human intellectual activity in a machine,
Uh-huh.
whether machines could one day like surpass human intelligence, especially in areas that we think of as like uniquely human, creativity, things like that. And then maybe the most debated question of all, whether a machine could actually be conscious in the same way that humans are.
Wow, some really big, heavy questions there.
Yeah, definitely.
And it sounds like there were some pretty different views, especially on that question of consciousness.
Right. So one perspective, which was very much rooted in their, dialectical materialism, argued that consciousness has this essential, like, subjective element to it,
Okay.
that it's fundamentally tied to human labor and social interactions, things that a machine, by its very nature, couldn't really replicate.
So, like, the social and historical context was crucial for them.
Exactly, yeah.
And this was kind of clashing with the more scientific drive to model the brain, right?
Yeah, there was definitely this tension there.
That's interesting.
But then there was this other more, like, empirical approach, as the report calls it, which focused more on actually modeling the brain structure and function. They knew it was a huge technological challenge at the time, but there was a clear and growing interest in this more scientific, less philosophical path.
Yeah, yeah. And then there's this like super interesting figure, A.N. Kolmogorov, this famous mathematician.
Right, Kolmogorov.
The report highlights his view, which was very optimistic about the possibility of machine thought.
Yeah, he really believed in it.
And he argued for like moving away from these arbitrary, preconceived notions of what life and thought are, and instead focusing on purely functional definitions.
Huh.
So his argument was basically, if you can build a model of a living or thinking being that's functionally complete enough, then within a materialistic framework, that model is a living or thinking being.
It's a powerful argument.
Yeah, it's pretty radical.
Yeah.
And the report suggests that this extreme empirical view, as they call it, that was coming out of Kolmogorov's school of thought was actually gaining a lot of traction.
Yeah, it seems like it.
Even the works of the Kazan Aviation Institute, which isn't exactly where you'd expect to find cutting-edge philosophical discussions.
Right.
Even they reportedly didn't find any convincing arguments against the idea that machines could think.
Wow.
And V.M. Glishkov, who was like this major figure in Soviet cybernetics, he also supported this view.
Glushkov, yeah.
He really emphasized this idea of a cybernetic system, whether it's biological or artificial, as being fundamentally like an abstract informational model.
Okay.
So his idea was that all activity, whether it's in a human or a machine, can be understood as the transformation of words within a standard alphabet. So to understand any cognitive system, you just need to figure out the rules that govern these informational transformations.
So it's all about information processing at its core.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this focus on information processing, that's a really key characteristic of the Soviet approach to AI, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, so want to shift gears a bit and talk about some of the specific research that was happening?
Yeah, let's do that.
Like, what were they actually working on?
Okay, so The report mentions that early on, their approach to problem solving, much like in the West, was to rely heavily on search.
Search.
Yeah, like basically trying out a ton of different solutions really fast to see what works. Brute force.
Okay.
But they quickly realized that this wasn't going to work for really complex
Yeah,
problems.
you can't just brute force your way through everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is what really sparked their interest in pattern recognition.
Pattern recognition. Okay.
Getting machines to identify objects sounds, all kinds of data.
Yeah.
And the development of pattern recognition devices in the Soviet Union actually goes back pretty far to like 1953.
Wow. Okay.
They were having these big discussions about the philosophical, physical, and psychological basis of perception.
So they were really thinking about the fundamentals.
Yeah. And by the time this 1964 report was put together, they'd made some real progress in areas like figuring out the minimum amount of information you need to describe an image for a machine to recognize it.
That's interesting.
The report specifically mentions E.L. Bloch and E.M. Braverman.
Okay.
They developed this thing called the compactness hypothesis as a theoretical framework.
The compactness hypothesis. Okay.
Yeah. And the idea is basically that similar patterns tend to cluster together in these compact regions within a high-dimensional mathematical space, which makes it easier for a machine to distinguish between different types of patterns.
So it's kind of like a way of thinking about how machines could learn to categorize things.
Exactly. It's a very elegant way of looking at it.
Yeah, it is.
And this wasn't just theoretical work. They were also doing research on how humans perceive the world.
Okay.
Like, there were studies that tracked the eye movements of little kids as they learned to recognize pictures.
Wow.
And the researchers tried to correlate these eye movements with how their recognition abilities were developing at different ages.
So they were looking at human learning as a model for machine learning.
Yeah, exactly.
That's fascinating.
They were also studying how quickly adults could recognize simple visual objects, and they compared their findings to predictions from information theory models of visual processing.
So really trying to like ground their approach in a deeper understanding of human cognition.
Exactly. And the report also talks about this seminar that was held in June 1960 that was all about reading devices.
Reading devices.
Oh, yeah. Machines that could automatically recognize written text.
So like over 60 years ago, they were already working on that.
Yeah, pretty amazing. Right?
That is amazing.
And what's really interesting is the sheer variety of approaches they were exploring.
Okay.
So the report lists 5 different machines that were under development, each using different techniques.
Yeah.
Some of them use line scanning to analyze the shapes of letters. Others focused on tracing the outlines of characters. And then there were these more like abstract methods like the quasi-topological approach.
The quasi-topological approach.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds complicated, but it basically involved identifying these fundamental structural features of a letter, like the number of ends and junctions in the lines that make up the letter, and they would encode these features as binary data.
Okay.
The report mentions that this method could have trouble with like noisy or distorted images,
Right.
and also with some Cyrillic letters that have the same basic structure.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But it's a really clever idea.
It is, yeah.
And then beyond these more like experimental approaches, they also had some actual reading machines that they had built and were testing.
Oh, wow.
So there was this universal reading automaton that was developed at the computing center of the Ukrainian SSR, and it was used with a Kiev computer. And then there was this other one, Kovalevsky's machine that reads.
Machine that reads.
It was at the Ukrainian Academy Computer Center.
Okay.
And this one was reportedly very good at recognizing typed numbers.
Really?
Yeah, even with imperfect samples. Its method was to compare an unknown image with a whole library of stored standard images that had undergone various transformations, just to account for slight variations.
That's clever.
Yeah, and Kovalevsky also came up with this really cool algorithm based on dichotomy.
Dichotomy.
Yeah, it's like sequentially dividing the possibilities into 2 classes.
Okay.
And the idea was to be able to handle really big alphabets, but keep the memory requirements of the system low.
So they were already thinking about the practicalities of implementing these systems.
Absolutely.
That's really interesting. Okay. So what about learning, induction, and planning?
Yeah, that's another big area. The report emphasizes how important learning is for making problem-solving machines more effective and adaptable.
Right, because if a machine can learn from its past experiences, it doesn't have to start from scratch every time.
Exactly. So the report says that back in the early 60s, research into planning and inductive reasoning, it was still pretty new,
Okay.
both in the USSR and in the West.
Makes sense.
but they were making progress in related fields like information theory, coding theory, and their work on brain modeling. All of that was laying the groundwork for future advancements in these more complex areas of AI.
Mm,
And the report names a few Soviet researchers, Braverman, Glushkov, and Azerman.
okay.
They were doing work on learning systems that was comparable to what was happening in the West.
So they were keeping up, basically.
Yeah, especially in areas like perceptron-type systems and algorithms for recognizing shapes.
Oh, interesting.
And there are some really cool examples of their work on learning systems.
Oh, tell me about those.
Okay, so one project at the Institute of Automation and Telemechanics, they were trying to program a machine to recognize handwritten digits.
Handwritten digits.
Yeah, and it apparently had a very low error rate.
Wow.
Even when they showed it digits it hadn't seen before.
So it was actually learning.
Yeah, and they were also testing the compact area hypothesis, that idea we talked about earlier, in the context of brain activity related to seeing similar images. That was at the Institute of Surgery.
Oh, wait.
And then at the Institute of Biophysics, they were exploring how to program a machine to recognize images by identifying key features, what they called indices.
Mm-hmm.
And even though they knew there would be mistakes, the Soviets really believed that this ability to learn and improve with experience was crucial for the future of AI.
Yeah, it makes sense. You can't have truly intelligent machines without them being able to learn.
Exactly.
So what else? Any other interesting examples?
Yeah, there's this one that really stands out. It's the work of Mark Iserman.
Iserman, okay.
He was working on recognizing handwritten digits, too.
Okay.
He came up with two different algorithms, and the second one was incredibly accurate. Like, it was reportedly 100% correct in one test and 85% in a tougher one.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, and what's really wild is that the second algorithm was very similar to one that was being used in the US at the same time, but for a totally different purpose, identifying sonar contacts.
Oh, wow. So they were arriving at similar solutions independently?
Yeah, it really shows how these parallel paths of research were happening on both sides of the Iron Curtain.
Absolutely. And, it speaks to the universality of some of these underlying principles.
Totally. Okay, another fascinating application they were exploring was at the Institute of Surgery imeni Vishnevsky.
Okay.
They were using pattern recognition and learning to assess burn injuries quickly.
Burn injuries.
Yeah, they trained the system on a database of past cases. And by inputting information about the burn, like its size, location, the patient's age, the computer could identify patterns and even predict the likely outcome.
Wow, so they were thinking about real-world medical applications.
Yeah, it seems so.
That's really impressive.
And the report also points out that a lot of the work being done on learning and induction fell under this umbrella of self-teaching or self-organizing systems.
Self-teaching, okay.
Yeah, and apparently a lot of this research wasn't published in the West. So there might have been a whole body of work that we just didn't know about.
That's fascinating.
It is. There was even a mention of a self-teaching machine that was discussed at a Soviet computing conference back in 1959.
Wow.
But the report doesn't give any details.
Too bad.
Yeah, I know. And then there's the work of A.G. Ivaknenko, who was applying ideas from automatic control theory to the design of self-organizing systems.
Ivaknenko, okay.
He came up with a way to categorize different types of learning systems, and he compared approaches in the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
So trying to see what the similarities and differences were.
Exactly. And he was particularly interested in perceptron-type devices.
Like Zetrons, okay.
But he was exploring some variations on the models that were being developed in the U.S.
So kind of building on their work, but also branching out in new directions.
Yeah, exactly.
That's cool.
And there was this discussion in 1962 about modeling instruction using automatic systems.
Okay.
They were looking at different learning theories, from Pavlovian conditioning to Gestalt psychology.
So a wide range of influences.
Yeah, and they analyzed different machine learning systems, including the perceptron and the work of Newell, Simon, and Shaw.
The pioneers.
Yeah, and the Soviet view seemed to be that training a machine is basically a process of automatically searching for and refining algorithms. Like a truly intelligent system should be able to find a good algorithm on its own without having to be programmed for every single possibility.
Yeah, it's like they were aiming for a higher level of autonomy.
Exactly.
That's really ambitious.
It is. And this interest in self-organizing systems actually goes back to 1959 with the work of Brains and Napolkov.
Brains in Napalka.
And this was closely connected to their research on modeling conditioned reflexes.
Okay.
Their goal was to come up with algorithms that could form new programs without having to go through every single possibility, kind of like how the brain is thought to work. And the report makes this interesting comparison. It says that the topics and the general level of achievement at Soviet meetings on self-learning systems in the early 60s were pretty similar to what was presented at the first U.S. conference on self-organizing systems in 1959.
Okay.
But they estimate that the Soviets were maybe 2 to 3 years behind the U.S. in this specific area by 1961.
So they were a bit behind, but still working on very similar things.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Okay, and then finally there's the area of brain modeling, which we talked about earlier in the context of their philosophical debates.
Right. Brain modeling.
This was a huge part of Soviet AI research.
Yeah.
They were trying to create computational models that could simulate different cognitive processes like pattern recognition and learning.
It's like really ambitious stuff.
Yeah. And the report says that this kind of research required them to move away from strict Pavlovian doctrine, which had been dominant in Soviet psychology for a long time.
Mm.
This shift started with a review by P.K. Anokin in 1955. And early brain modeling experiments began at the Laboratory of Electromodeling in 1957.
Wow.
By 1960, Napolkov was describing more intensive and sophisticated investigations into how the brain processes information, but still within the framework of conditioned reflexes.
Mm.
And by 1962, they had developed much more advanced algorithms that were designed to mimic neural processes.
So they were making real progress.
Yeah. And they even built a physical learning machine at the Power Engineering Institute that exhibited what they called self-organization.
Wow. Okay.
This machine was based on neurophysiological algorithms, and it was a collaboration with SN Brain's Neurophysiological Laboratory.
That's really cool. So they were actually building physical models of the brain.
Yeah, pretty amazing. And it wasn't just limited to the Soviet Union. The report mentions a Czech researcher, E. Golas, who was studying generalization in pattern recognition and learning from a psychological perspective.
Mm.
His research involved analyzing how human subjects perceived common elements across different stimuli.
So they were really trying to understand the underlying principles of intelligence from multiple angles.
Yeah. It shows a broader interest in these fundamental questions within the Eastern Bloc.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into early Soviet AI research, what are your main takeaways?
For me, it's just the sheer level of support that AI was getting from the Soviet government and the party. This wasn't just some side project. It was a major national priority.
Yeah, they really saw it as strategically important.
And the research they were doing, pattern recognition, machine learning, planning, brain modeling, it often mirrored what was happening in the West, but it was also shaped by their own philosophical and ideological context.
Absolutely. And those philosophical debates they were having about machine thought and consciousness, those were really fascinating.
Yeah, the fact that top scientists and party officials were involved in these discussions, it really shows you how seriously they were taking it.
Yeah, they weren't shying away from the big questions.
And they were making real progress, developing reading machines, learning algorithms, all sorts of things.
Often coming up with similar solutions to the West, even though they were working independently.
Yeah, it's really remarkable.
And I think one thing that really stood out to me was just how deeply the philosophical questions were intertwined with the scientific research.
Yeah.
They weren't just building machines. They were trying to understand the nature of intelligence itself.
Yeah, and all of this was happening within this very specific political and ideological system.
Right, which makes you wonder how that might have influenced the long-term trajectory of AI research, not just in the Soviet Union, but globally.
Yeah, it's a really important question. Given that emphasis on AI for societal management in the USSR, how did those different contexts shape the development and application of AI in other parts of the world?
It makes you think about the echoes of those early divergences that we might still be seeing today.
Yeah, definitely something to ponder.
It is.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. Thanks for joining me.
My pleasure.